I'm interviewing Louie Bellson. His wife Francine Bellson is here with us, and he's giving me some great. Oh, look at this with Carson. How great! Look at the way you're looking at him. That's great.
Right.
Oh, these are excellent.
But that's a nice picture with Ellington there. And of course
Yes, it is.
That was
And with Basie.
Gretsch Drums.
And you doing. I like this.
In fact, it's worthy to note the fact that Skin Deep was recorded on Gretsch Drums. That's kind of a classic, you know.
Yes, it is.
And we didn't do it in the studio. We did it on the road. And a guy named Bert Porter, who was involved with, at that time, they didn't have stereo, they had hi-fi. Ampex was big. And he did it on Ampex, and we sent that in to Columbia. And they said, "Boy, why don't you do this? We can't do anything like that. You know, catch all the fast beats and drumming, make them clear." And it was on the Gretsch Drums.
This is great.
Yeah.
This is great. Well, I guess the best way to start this is for me to kind of describe how I'm going to do this book, and then we can just do an interview.
Mm-hmm.
And I want this to be free form, whatever comes to your mind.
It's an interesting way I joined, if you want to put that on tape, but an interesting way I joined. Oh, you're running now?
All right, let's go.
A lot of people say, well, how come, like you said, you started on Slingerland, how come you went to Gretsch? I said, well, yes, I was with Slingerland first, and when I left home to join Ted Fiorito was the first band I joined when I left home, because I sat in with his band when they came to my hometown, and he offered me a job right there, but I said, well, no, I've got 3 or 4 months of high school to do, and I want to get my diploma. He said, okay, you get that diploma, and you come out to California, you got a job. So I thought maybe, you know, in 3 or 4 months he'd forget, he'd get somebody else, but kept his word. And
how do you spell his name?
Ted Fiorito, F-I-O, and capital R-I-T-O. He was a great piano player and a big songwriter. He wrote things like "I Never Knew," a lot of hit tunes, you know. And on that particular, when I joined him, it was at the Florentine Gardens, and the Mills Brothers were the main attraction on there. So right away I got a chance to play with some real pros, you know, and they were wonderful guys. They took me, we ate together, and they taught me more about show business than just about anybody, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so after, you know, I just stayed with Ted for about 3 or 4 months there, because on one of the occasions working at the Florentine Gardens, Benny Goodman's brother, Freddie Goodman, happened to wander in, and he heard me play, and he wrote a note, had me come over to the table and said, "How would you like to audition for Benny Goodman?" I started stuttering, and he said, "Yeah, well, Benny's in town doing a movie, and he's looking for a drummer, and I think you would be just perfect for the band." So now I'm thinking, Ted was nice enough to get me out of Moline. What am I going to do? What am I going to say to Ted? So I took the issue up with all the guys in Ted's band. They said, "Lou, go. It isn't ever. You won't have that chance ever in life, you know. King of Swing." So we didn't tell Ted, and I didn't know how to tell him, in fact. And in those days we took a train instead of a plane. So they got me on a train with Benny Goodman's band. They explained to Ted later on. He got a little peeved, you know, but then he said, "Well, it's okay. It was a chance, and you did it, you know."
What year was this?
That's 46. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, I'm going way beyond that. This was 1942. Yeah, because see, I went back with Ted Fiorito and then Benny Goodman after the war. But anyway, yeah, this was in '42. So when I joined Benny's band, Freddie and all the guys around Benny said, "Well, look, one thing you want to do is he has what they call the ray. He has a way of looking at you, but don't let it disturb you." So already they fixed me up with that, you know. And but then they also told me that Benny's got a contract with Gretsch Drum Company. So I said, "Well, yeah, but I use Slingerland drums." They said, "Well, what can I tell you?" So in order to not create any waves, and I'm being 17 years old, I couldn't walk up to Benny Goodman and say, "Hey, man, this is what I use, okay?" Otherwise, he'd say, "Hey, kid, get out of here," So I went along with what the instructions were, Benny had a contract with Gretch, so that's how I started with Gretsch Drum Company. I found out much later on that if I had walked up to Benny and said, "Benny, I don't tell you not to use a Selmer or clarinet, so I use sling drums," Benny would have said, "It's okay with me, kid." They were just supplying Benny with drums if he needed them, see.
Right.
But as a 17-year-old kid, but it's okay because I had a wonderful relationship with the Gretsch Drum Company. I was there for 20 years, and well, it seems like a long time, doesn't it? 20 years. It is a long time.
It is a long time.
But Phil Grant, a beautiful man. We maintained friendship even after I left the company. But I went over to the factory many times in Brooklyn. That was, what, 60 Broadway, Brooklyn?
Yes, that's correct.
See, I remember the address now. I'd go over during the day, and we'd talk business. I'd see Fred Gretsch Jr. and Emerson Strong. He was another, I think he's long gone now, but all three of us would go out and have lunch and talk about the value of the drums and what was in store for the future and what can we do to make our products better. And, they were the first drum company to make a solid shell, no seam at all. Where the other companies had a seam, this was a solid, round shell. And their drums always had a great sound. And even today, you got guys like Tony Williams, people like that using the Gretsch drums. They're fantastic drums. They're right up there with all the best companies, In fact, I think their snare drum is probably one that they can't duplicate, not even in Japan.
Can we talk about the early years a little bit? I'd like to talk about some of the early endorsers of Gretsch drums, and I've got a list of them, and if I could just rattle off a list and you could tell me your feelings about some of these guys. The first one is Billy Gladstone.
Billy Gladstone, well, there was you could use the word genius with him. I don't use that word too much, but I use it with Ellington and Billy Strayhorn, but Billy Gladstone was a genius, there's no question about it. The man was an impeccable player, and besides being that great of a player, he was an inventor. And everything he did was meticulous. If you walked into his room, you didn't see anything out of place. Well, honey, you wouldn't have liked him. Because being an engineer, she's like that. She's a perfectionist, which is wonderful. That's great. I am in sort of a way, but I get to be a little slop jaw when certain things I'm used to it, But anyway, Billy Gladstone did everything the way he played. When you watched him play, and Buddy Rich and I used to walk into the Radio City just to watch him play, and you could see him from the pit, from the audience-wise, you could see from the waist on up, and the way he commanded the respect of playing that wonderful instrument that he invented and made himself, and the sound that he got. And just a snare drum alone, nothing else, and just to hear him play those rolls and everything, it seems kind of childish to say a snare drum, but he made it sound like it was a Rolls Royce or a Hammond organ, And when you can do that with just a snare drum, that's what kind of artist he was, And I don't know if you know this, but he was part of a quartet. Murray Spivak, who was my teacher for a long time, he just passed away. Murray Spivak, Billy Gladstone, Max Manne, Shelly Manne's father, and Carl Glassman, who played timpani with Toscanini. They were known as the Four Horsemen in New York. Whenever something had to be done to perfection in percussion, they hired one of those four guys, or maybe two or three of them, or maybe all four of them. But they were the Four Horsemen.
When did you first meet Billy Gladstone? Do you remember?
In 42, when I joined Benny's band, on my way to New York, we played the Hotel New Yorker. And when I went over to see Phil Grant, Phil said, "You got to meet Billy Gladstone." I said, "Yeah, I've heard so much about him. I really want to meet him, And Shelly Manne had told me about Billy too, because Shelly Manne is one of the few guys that Billy made an entire set, handmade, gave it to Shelly. Because, with Max Manne, his father, but Shelly was also a great player. And he made just a snare drum for me, but he made a complete set for Shelly. And I don't know whatever happened. I hope they got that in a museum, because it was gorgeous just to look at it, I mean, you could see it was a work of art, But that's the first time in 42, through Phil Grant, I met Billy Gladstone.
Now, he made a drum for you, that's correct.
He, later on, 1947, I was with Tommy Dorsey's band at the Statler Hotel. I didn't know it, but he walked into the room while we're performing. We had about 15 minutes before a radio broadcast, and Billy Gladstone walked in with this case, and he said, "This is for you." And when I took that drum out of the case, solid maple shell, handmade by Billy Gladstone, all the metal parts made by Billy Gladstone, three-way key, tighten the top alone, bottom alone, from the top, or top and bottom all together, and he had gut snares on the bottom of it. And we're just getting ready to do a broadcast. And Billy waited. He wanted to hear the drum, And now, you got saxophone players and trumpet players in a big band. They don't know too much about drums, but if they hear something unusual, they'll look back, And all during the radio program, which was about half hour, not only Tommy, but all the guys in the band kept turning around and going like this to me, because they were used to hearing the other snare drum, which wasn't a Billy Gladstone snare drum. And all of a sudden they heard this new sound, and they all came to me afterward and said, what were you playing on back there? So I showed them. They said, no wonder. But that's how great that drum sounded. And there's a lot of history to that drum now. I lent it to my brother, because he was stuck for a drum, and I said, look, this is a prized possession. Somebody stole it from him. So it was gone for a long time. Finally, Bob Yeager, with the drum shop in Hollywood,
right,
had a phone call from a Johnny Miller, who has a drum shop in Kansas City. He said, guess what? A guy just brought a drum in. It's a prize drum made for Louie by Billy. Bob Yeager said, get it. Pay the guy, I don't care what it is, and ship it out to me. It belongs to Louie. Well, he got the drum. He put it on his shelf to exhibit, And this is right before the earthquake in '72 in L.A. That's the only drum that fell down. But luckily, it didn't crack the shell, but it bent some of the hardware. So we immediately sent it to Teddy Reed in Florida, who took over all of Billy Gladstone's material. And Ted put it back in shape. He had all the tools, and I've got it. I gave it to Harvey Mason to play, because Harvey heard so much about that drum. And Harvey, he's got a very beautiful wife. See, he said, "I'll give you anything. I'll even give you my wife." Harvey's a beautiful man. He said, "That snare drum, Lou, is the greatest snare drum I ever played on in my life." And Harvey's a great player. He's not only a great drum set player, he's a marvelous percussionist. He plays timpani, vibes, everything. And I let him use it for about 4 weeks. I think a little longer than that. I said, "Go ahead and have a ball," And I've got it home. I think I showed it to you, didn't I, Francine? Did I show it to you? Did you show the drum? I got to show it to her. It's just a magnificent work of art,
How about Chick Webb?
Chick Webb, man. Well, there was one of my teachers. I mean, just listening to him, watching him play. Chick Webb, as maybe for a lot of people that didn't realize, he was a very tiny man, and he had an affliction. He had, I don't like to use the word hunchback, but that's what he had. I don't know what the medical term is. Chick Webb was another one that you could call a genius. Of the two drummers in the history of drumming, him and Buddy Rich had a lot of the same qualities, where they couldn't read. It was just a God-given talent. Chick Webb somebody would bring an arrangement in, and Don Redmond, famous Don Redmond, and people like Benny Carter and Milt Hinton, all these guys told me that when they would bring an arrangement in, he'd play it down once, and immediately he had his part sculled out. Not only his part, but he could sing all the saxophone parts and all the brass parts. Because Milt Hinton, every time he got a new arrangement, Milt would say, he'd call Milt, he'd say, Milt, listen to this. Ba-doo-da, ba-doo-da, ba-doo-da-doo-da. That's the trumpets. Listen, the saxophones are going ba-doo-da-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo. And he's singing all the parts, you know. But Chick Webb, to reiterate what Gene Krupa said, Gene told me, Lou, he said, first of all, Gene Krupa studied to be a priest. That he was on his way to priesthood. And he heard Baby Dodds play drums. When he heard Baby Dodds play, he just looked up and said, God, excuse me, I'm going to be a little late coming up to you because I got to play drums first. This guy made him quit that, not quit, I shouldn't say that. He just detoured him a little bit, you know. That's how powerful Baby Dodds was.
Oh, it's better? Okay.
On top of that, there was a battle of bands in those days. That the Benny Goodman band with Kruger playing drums played the Savoy Ballroom. There was always a battle of bands, and he had to play opposite Chick Webb. And Gene told me every time he had to do that, he said, Lou, I'm going to get me another drum lesson tonight. But it's too bad that the young drummers today don't have footage, because in those days there were no video cameras, and he didn't make many records, because the kids hear me talking about it, they hear Buddy Rich talk about it, and they say, what can we get? It's too bad, because the guy was a master player, just a God-given talent. You know, and he's the first one that had Ella Fitzgerald in his wonderful band. And he had a lot of great players too. But Chick Webb, Big Sid Catlett, and Joe Jones. Wasn't for those three guys, I wouldn't be playing today.
Let's talk about another one. Joe Jones was
Joe
a Gretsch
Jones.
endorser.
Well, there was another Chick Webb. I mean, Joe was the first drummer. I mean, before Joe Jones, drummers played, but they played sort of like maybe a little too aggressive and staccato. When Joe came on the picture with Basie's band, you heard the drive, but you heard a fluid drive. You know what I'm trying to say? It's hard to describe it in words. You have to really hear it. But you didn't hear the staccato kind of drumming, which is okay, but you heard the fluidity of the bassy rhythm section, and all of a sudden a new color came in. See, Joe Jones. Because you ask anybody, Max Roach, who was your favorite player? Papa Joe. Because he created something new, you know.
About O'Neill Spencer.
O'Neill Spencer, oh boy. Now there's O'Neill Spencer with the John Kirby band. Now I got to know him quite well because Charlie Shavers was in that band. In fact, Charlie Shavers wrote a lot of the music. And Charlie was on Tommy Dorsey's band, and Charlie Shavers and I were roommates for 3 years. So Charlie and I wrote a lot of music together, and he used to talk often about the brushwork by O'Neill Spencer. Because that group, Russell Procope, Buster Bailey, Billy Kyle, John Kirby, and Charlie Shavers, and O'Neill Spencer, those guys played at the Ambassador East Hotel, the swankiest hotel in the world. And they played soft musical jazz like you never heard before. And there's O'Neill playing the brushes. And he actually started a lot of guys, what guys are doing today. Between him and Joe Jones, they were masters with the brushes. They knew how to play in a rhythm section and keep it down to a level. You don't have to play loud. And they proved that. O'Neill was a very musical player. Yeah. I learned a lot from him. Yeah.
About Nick Fatool.
Oh, Nick Fatool. There's another guy who played Gretch, right?
All these are Gretsch endorsers.
Oh, boy. Well, Nick to me, personified what Benny Goodman was always looking for in the back of his head. Benny Goodman was a very quiet man. You never knew what he was thinking. You know, that's why I guess he gazed at you. He had the ray, what they call the ray, and it disturbed a lot of people. You know, it didn't disturb Lionel Hampton because nothing disturbed him. Once he got on the vibraphones, he was out there. which is beautiful, complete concentration, But Benny was very particular about drummers. I mean, he loved Gene. Yeah, he came to me often and said, he said, I like what you and Buddy do. He said, but Gene was my man. And, well, rightfully so. I mean, all the records prove it, and what Gene did. Gene was not only a master showman, but he was a great player. But when Nick Fatool came in, Nick was not like Gene. He wasn't a flamboyant soloist, but boy, what he did in the rhythm section is magic, really. And Benny knew it. Benny said, this is what a player should sound like when he's playing in a band. Not when you're playing a solo, but when you're playing in a band, this is the way you play drums. The way Nick Fatool played drums. And he did the same thing in Artie Shaw's band. He's just a musical player. Everything he did was in the right place. If he hit an accent, you can bet that the accent fell at the right place. Now, today, you got a lot of hot-shot drummers. They're great, but sometimes they overplay, some of them underplay. He played right where he should have been. That's what made him so great. We got a young player today by the name of Steve Gadd that follows that pattern. No tricks, he can do it all. But when he plays in a band, he listens. And whatever he puts on the drum set is pertaining to what he hears musically. And that was Nick Fatool.
Okay. You just mentioned him, Davy Tuff.
Davy Tuff.
You're having a good time.
Davy Tuff, I had a long talk with Tommy Dorsey about Davy Tuff once. And Tommy Dorsey always liked a drummer. He showcased a drummer. That's why he had Buddy Rich. He had I played in the band. He had Krupa for a while. He liked to expose his players, especially a drummer. Give him the spotlight. Play a drum solo, long drum solo. But Davy couldn't do that. But yet there was something about Davy, like Nick Fatool. Those guys were very much alike. Now, Davy Tuff could not make a snare drum roll. Now here's a Davy Tuff could not make a snare drum roll. In those days when you played the vaudeville theaters, you had to play for jugglers and acrobats, and the roll was very important. Davy Tuff would go up to the performer and say, I'll do the best I can, but I cannot make a snare drum roll. It's not going to be even. And the guy said, oh, Davy Tuff, you're putting me on. Davy said, no, I'm very serious. I'm very dedicated to my craft. I'm telling you that in front that you may not like it, you may want to get another player or whatever. But they said, oh no, you go ahead. But his role was rub-a-dub roll, And right to the day before he died, he wanted to learn how to play timpani and learn how to make a snare drum roll. I was with the Dorsey band, and Davy was in the hospital at that time. They let him out on weekends, and he came in to hear us play. He was a great poet, first of all. I don't know what ever happened to all the poetry he wrote, but he was a great poet, very sensitive young man. His problem, he had a drinking problem, which everybody knew. And even when he played on Woody Herman's band, they always had another drummer waiting. When Buddy would collapse, when Davy would collapse, well, they'd have somebody else take his place. But he did something. Shelly Manne told me he was the first drummer to play what we call soft drums. I don't mean soft in dynamics. I'm talking about in the days when you had a calfskin head and you played on a bright day, that head stretched to the point where you couldn't loosen it to get a Seiko sound. So he used to come with a little pail of water and a chamois skin and rub that head down so that it was loose enough you could get a good Seiko sound out of the bass drum and the tom-toms. And Shelly followed that until you finally got a way of getting a collar on a drum set. See, the early calfskin heads, unless you knew what to do, see, we had to tuck our own drum heads. If you broke a drum head, you had to soak the drum head overnight and then put it on the drum. But a lot of guys didn't tighten it up enough to get a collar. See, that by getting a collar, then you can loosen it to get that Seiko sound. Otherwise, if you loosen it to a point you don't have a collar, you have a boardy sound and ringing. See, and then of course you had to muffle it too. But he was the first guy to do that, and his no technique at all, but yet he could play the brushes and the sticks, and he had a certain sound on the cymbals that nobody else could do. He was a mystery, really. Two guys, Joe Jones and Davy Tuff, were the only two guys that I saw play the out course, the shout course, on brushes. That's usually wood, that's
Right.
usually sticks.
Oh, yeah.
And the band leader will say, give me the wood and give me all you got. Those two guys, and proof of the pudding is, if you hear Apple Honey, Woody Herman's Apple Honey, with Davy Tuff is on that, that's brushes. He's playing brushes there. Chubby Jackson told me, he was playing bass on that, he said, I never heard a drummer play brushes, and it was so solid and so much there that you didn't miss the sticks. So those two guys were exceptional, and you know, maybe there were other drummers who could do that, but for some reason everybody used sticks, everybody. But those two guys on certain tunes would play the out course on brushes, and boy, when you hear that record of Apple Honey, you say, gee whiz. And Davy again was like Nick Fatool too. He didn't bother about drum solos. He knew he couldn't do them, and that's smart, because if you know you can't do something and you're in the limelight, you do what you can do. That's what made Gene so good. Gene said, look, to me, he said, Lou, I can't do what you and Buddy do. You got to go with your technique. He said, but what he did was so powerful and right, and he did what he knew, and he did it very good. And I'm sure that's the same thing with Buddy Rich. He knew he couldn't step in and play with a symphony orchestra because he didn't read, and he knew he couldn't do this on the spur of the moment. He couldn't do that. But what he could do was sit down and play in a jazz band, big band or small band. Boom, and he did it. Davy was another one of the musical drummers like Nick Fatool. You know, big ears when it came to music, and Bud Freeman almost said to me, he said, Davy would get behind me with that beat of his, and I couldn't miss. That's the greatest thing that any drummer can have, is an instrumentalist of some kind, a tenor saxophone player, a trumpet player, say, man, you made me swing. That's what drum set's all about. Solos are great. If you can do it, they're marvelous, and if they're done by people that know how to do them, beautiful. Flip Phillips, who's celebrating his 80th birthday this year, I'm sorry I can't be there he wanted me to be there, but he told me many times on Woody Herman's band, he said one time on Apple Honey, he got behind, he was right in front of Davy Tuff, and Davy started playing a big Chinese cymbal, which he had, one of the first guys to do that. And he played such a beat in back of me that when I finished playing my chord, I kept playing. When I finished, he said it was better than an orgasm. He told me. He said, I put down my saxophone and I yelled, yeah, yeah, yeah. You know, just like the heavens opened up. Really. He said, I never had that feeling in my life. Davy Tuff did it, back there with that cymbal, and just kept egging him on, just booting him, you know. And Flip said, how do you get that? A guy can give you a whole lot of money and you won't get that kind of feeling. You know what I mean? That's the magic thing about music, about drumming. Davy did that to Flip Phillips.
Wow.
So if you ever have a chance to talk to Flip, tell him Louie told me about the time Davy Tuff, he'd say, man, that was it. That was it. Put the saxophone down and screamed, you know? Said, that's it. If I could get that all the time, it would be like heaven, you know?
Now I'm going to ask you about some people that aren't quite as famous, but you might have had an experience with them.
Yeah.
Okay. How about Alberto Cauldron, played with Xavier Cougar?
Oh.
Any experience with
Yes. Boy, I forgot about that name because I got to know Cougar. Pearl and I got to know Cougar very well. Yeah. Those Latin players, to me, were always sensational. I took the Latin players when I was in my early stage of playing. In fact, when I first came to New York, Buddy Rich and I used to go into Henry Adler's music store on 46th Street. And there he had a guy named Umberto Morales teaching Latin. And I said, Henry, I want to talk to Umberto. I want to learn how to play the mambos and the cha-chas and everything, because the cha-chas were big, in those days, mambos and everything. And I often wondered, how come the Latin guys and the jazz players don't get together? People used to say, oh no, they play strict 8-note feel, jazz players play more of a rolling triplet feel. Okay, that's fine. But I said, I started listening to Machito and all these guys, and they're playing jazz on the Latin beat. So there's got to be something, and people used to say, oh no, you're off base, Lou. But I stuck with it. And sure enough, today, you see a lot of the Latin players or jazz players playing sambas and things. They're beautiful, But Umberto taught me some of the early Latin things, and I started listening to all those players, and this guy was one of them.
Okay.
Sensational players. And those guys love jazz. All of them, every one of them. And Dizzy, of course, started with Chano Pozo, and then he did records with Machito, and he really got into it. I mean, he really knew. He was playing conga drums himself. And boy, there's another one of my teachers, Dizzy Gillespie. Dizzy taught me so much about playing drums that I'll never forget him. And he was a beautiful man too, But the Latin players, he was one of them.
How about Shelly Manne? You mentioned.
Oh, Shelly Manne. You just saw me smile. Shelly, I had a chance to play with Shelly a lot. Now you might say, what? What do you mean? Well, Shelly went out to Hollywood before I did, and he did the wonderful work on West Side Story, the motion picture. In fact, Murray Spivak was in the sound. It made Shelly sweat, because that's a lot of intricate drumming on that, And Shelly did a beautiful job. But Shelly and I worked a lot together on movies where they called in 3 or 4 drummers to do certain work, and Shelly and I were the two set players. And boy, I learned a lot from him too, really. Finesse, brushes, musical, taste. There's a word for Shelly Manne. Everything he did was in such good taste, elegant, And he could do it all too. He could play solos, and he was not much like Buddy Rich. He was a very witty guy. Shelly was very funny. He came up with lines that were like Buddy, And but my association with Shelly was, last time I saw him, he was at the John Anson Ford Theater, and it was a day for him. The whole day was devoted to Shelly Manne Day. And I didn't get there till way late in the afternoon, and he was playing all day long. And when he saw me, he said, "Oh, Lou, man, please give me some relief, will you?" So I sat in and took over for the next hour or two to give him a little breather, because he'd been playing for about 6-8 hours, And our parting words, last time I saw him, we hugged one another, and I said, "I love you, man." And he said to me, "I love you too." And that's the last thing. But the drummers gives you an idea of how close drummers were, Shelly Manne also was the kind of a guy that if they'd call him to do something, he was the first call man anyway, and he couldn't do it, he'd say, "Why don't you call Louie, or why don't you call Earl Palmer, or whoever was available, Johnny Guerin," whoever, always looking out for somebody else, But he was a player when he joined Woody's band and all these bands. I think on Stan's band, to be frank with you, he was a little bit unhappy on that band, because the Stan Kenton band was great, but he had to play and roll on those cymbals loud, and Shelly, I think, wanted to play a little more musical. Not saying that Stan was not playing more musical, but they were really a production unit, with really the trumpet players had to wear those belts, and play all those high notes, and because when it comes down to the swing bands, you have to say Duke, Basie, Lionel, Jimmy Lunsford, Woody Herman, Benny Goodman, Charlie Barnett. These were the swing bands. Mm-hmm. You wouldn't even include Glenn Miller, because it was the greatest dance band, right. And he made more money than anybody else. Great band, but not a swing band, So I think when he joined Woody's band and later did all the things that he did, then you really heard Shelly at his very best, and all those small groups that he worked with. Taste, excellent.
How about a fellow by the name of Dick Shanahan? Played with Charlie Burnett.
Oh, Dick Shanahan. Now there's one of the unsung heroes. Dick Shanahan, when I first heard him with Les Brown, I said, wow, man, here's a guy that's got all the Buddy Rich technique, or a Chick Webb technique, hands and feet, he had it all, and yet he sounded great in Les's band. He could really swing. Unsung hero, really. Never got really the just dues that he, in those days it was either Krupa, Rich, Joe Jones, and fine, or myself. Yeah, I'm the younger of that group. I can say I can beat them. I'm the younger of the group. But Dick was always. I'd say, boy, you want to hear a guy play? Listen to Dick Shanahan. Oh yeah, really? And would pass by, sensational player. I hope Dick is still playing. I don't know if he's still playing or not. I know he married one of the group there, the singers that were on Tommy Dorsey's band. And last thing I heard, way later he got a drum shop in Hollywood, and he did away with that. He was doing some teaching, and I just lost track of him. But I hope he's still playing because he's a fantastic player.
How about George Wetley?
George Wetley. Oh boy, there's another guy. There's one of the old players, him and Orman Downs. Those guys, what they could do, Chet, they did something that's almost out of style anymore, and it may come back again, but they could do press rolls on a snare drum. Baby Dodds, Zooty Singleton, George Wetley, Ray McKinley can still do it. There's one of the guys that Benny liked. When he talked about guys that could play the snare drum, he said, not only Krupa, Ray McKinley, but George Wetley was like that. Those guys could sit behind a set of drums and play, and it didn't sound like anything military. It was just a groove, and they're playing rolls on a snare drum. Because they learned to do that years ago because there was no hi-hat. And cymbals were something that you stayed away from because they couldn't record them good, see. So as a result, that's why Gene said when he heard Baby Dodds, he heard him playing the snare drum, and it was so groovy, because Gene did that on Benny Goodman's band too, if you notice. He played a lot of press rolls, you see. And George Wetley was one of him and Zooty were some of the first guys I heard do that. And beautiful. Great drummer too, he was a great drummer. Those guys could read. They had a great quality about the sound that they got, and all of them had identifiable sounds. Today, you hear a lot of great players, but it's hard to distinguish. You say, well, they're all playing great, but the sound is not as individual as those guys were. See? Shelly Manne had a certain sound. Buddy Rich had a certain sound. Krupa had a certain sound. Joe Jones, Chick Webb, Big Sid, Jimmy Crawford with the Jimmy Lunsford band. They all had identifiable sounds. And that's what made them so great, Today, we have a lot of little Buddy Riches running around, and a lot of little Steve Gadds running around, a lot of little Joe Jones. And what I say to those youngsters is, that's fine, but don't try to copy somebody right down to what they can do. There's no two of anything alike. It's like you go to the factory, you're not going to find two cymbals alike. And yeah, learn certain beats and things, but don't try to copy them all the way. You're never going to do it. You're going to be a bad carbon copy, and you're going to be criticized for it. But pick up things that they did that you can use, but play from your heart. See, that's why those guys were so great. We listened to one another, picked up things, but we always played the way we did it.
How about Kenny Clark?
Kenny Clark? Oh boy, father of bebop drumming. Kenny Clark. The first time I heard him, I didn't care what he did with the left hand or the hi-hat or the bass drum. This was so strong. We call it the bread and butter beat. Beam, ding, 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 ding. That was so strong, and it just made you either nod your head or pat your foot. That was that groovy. That's why he was able to play what they call bebop drums. take the emphasis off of 4 beats on the bar down here, you know, because you got a guy like Ray Brown playing. He's like a truck coming at you. He's got 1, 2, 3, 4 covered, you know. So what Klug would do is just keep that right hand going, and with that left hand syncopated and syncopate with the bass drum. But the way he did it was so musical, so great. Yeah, fantastic player. Out of him came Max Roach. Because I know Klug listened to Joe Jones, there's no question, and Chick Webb, you know. And he went a little beyond that because those guys played the bass drum, 4 beats to the bar. That's the kind of music he had to play it with, you know. But with bebop coming in, Kenny created another avenue of playing, not having to worry about that bass drum being 4 beats to the bar, because you got the bass doing that. So he comped like a piano player would, but a certain comping that was conducive to the piano, the bass, and what he added was right. So there again, there's an innovator, pure innovator. He played. I think he played. I heard Dizzy play say on an interview that he played as good for me as anybody. He liked Max naturally. He liked Art Blakey and Klug, you know. But always the first guys, the innovators, are always guys you have to watch out for because man, they started that, and they know what's going on. They separate the men from the boys, you know. They know how to do that. But the great statement that Dizzy made when Art Blakey passed away, the interviewer was saying, "Well, Dizzy, how do you define Art Blakey?" So Dizzy hesitated and he said, "Well, first of all, 2 of my favorite players. One is still living. Max Roach was the professor, and Art Blakey was a volcano." I thought that was a great description. He was. That guy he got in there, and boy, look out, exploded, you know. And but getting back to these other players, they all had that identification.
How about Shadow Wilson?
Oh boy, there's another guy. Shadow was probably the best replacement for Joe Jones on the Basie band, and his 4-bar break on Queer Street, the record Queer Street, Buddy and I used to talk about it. It's a classic. It's a lot of drummers tried to figure out the sticking and what he did. It's so intricate and so musical that guys even today when they hear it they say, wait, what is he doing there, you know? But Shadow Wilson was really the correct replacement for Joe Jones because he loved Joe anyway, first of all, and he had the sound, and he knew the Basie band. And I don't know whether Shadow's still living or not. I think he passed away, but I don't think he took too good care of himself. It's too bad because he was a marvelous guy and a great player. That was another one. Another unsung hero. I mean, he got recognition, but not what he deserved, you know.
What about Denzel Best?
Brushes. Denzel, and I know he could play sticks, but on George Shearing's group, where he gained his recognition, he had to play brushes all the time. But boy, couldn't get any better than that. Because you know when he left that group, he said, "Lou, I don't know what I want to do. I'm afraid to pick up the sticks anymore." But I think it just took him a little time to get used to it again. But because there's another guy that played with excellent taste, very much like Shelly Manne, you know. No tricks, just solid playing. You know they're there. And guys used to love to play with those kind of players because they had that magic, they had that feel.
Don Lamond.
Don is still living. I see him quite often. Another Gretsch user. Well, when he got into Woody Herman's band, see, I knew Don way before that. He's from Washington, D.C., and I heard him play years ago with a group like with Earl Swope, Angelo Tomprost, Freddie Otis, Merv Oliver, bass player, and Irving Markowitz, a trumpet. That was an excellent small band. I mean, those guys, they played at a place called the Kavaka's Grill in Washington, D.C. So I heard him play, and I knew what a great player he was. So when he joined Woody's band, I had never heard him in the big band capacity. And boy, I went down to Birdland and the Royal Roost to hear him play. And he did something on a record. What is that slow blues thing? He plays some intricate things in between the time that I never heard anybody else do. It was Don Lamond, you know. He's on Four Brothers.
I've got news for you. Right?
Yeah,
Okay.
I've got news for you. At the Reed section, they harmonized a whole lick by Charlie Parker, and there's spaces in there, and he fills it up with those things that he did. It's hard to explain it. And when you hear it, you'll know what I'm talking about.
Okay.
Great player, great player.
Mel Lewis.
Unique style, very bebop player, you know. But he could also get into the straight ahead swing bag, you know. And I think he's still working around somewhere around Orlando. And great player, because every time I go down there, I see him, you know. And I think about those times when I first heard him with Woody's band, you know. Great. I'm glad those things are on record so these young players can hear that, hear what he did, you know, hear what all these players did, you know.
How about Mel Lewis?
Oh, Mel Lewis. Now, there's another guy. Another guy that really didn't enjoy playing drum solos. He could play them, but his bag was playing for the band. Buddy Rich and I would take those old Terry Gibbs records, albums that he did, and Buddy would say, boy, listen to the way he swings that band. He's playing on the garbage band. We call it the garbage, the Chinese cymbal. Well, what can you say? He's the epitome of what Joe Jones did, you know, and I know Joe was one of his favorite players. The first time I heard Mel Lewis, he was with the Glenn Miller band, traveling on the road with the Glenn Miller band. I was with Duke. And Mel was kind of unhappy because, you know, in the back of his head he's saying, okay, I'm playing now, but I want to get further, see. And I knew what he was talking about. We used to sit down and talk, and I said, Mel, just go straight ahead. I know what you're thinking, you know. You're playing music now. You're playing the Glenn Miller music, which is fine. He said, yeah, I'm making a living, but I want to go further. And I understand what he was talking about. The next thing you know, he joined Stan Kenton's band. Now, what I'm saying now is nothing derogatory about Stan Kenton's music. I mean, it was great music. But when Mel Lewis joined that band, him and Stan Levy, that band started to swing. Mainly because Stan had hired Bill Holman to do some charts, and there's one of the all-time greats. They had Frank Rossellino in the band, Conte Condoli, Bud Shank, all these guys. See, that early band, if Shelly had been in that band, it would have swung just like Mel would do it, because those guys are from the same mold. But see what I'm saying? Stan went from a production band orchestra, which is fine, what came into a swing band. I mean, a hardcore swing band with Bill Holman writing charts. I mean, how are you going to miss? You know, and he was in that band. Mel was in that band. That's when you really started to hear Mel Lewis, what he could do. And then, of course, he joined Woody's band. He was in Woody's band. And then when him and Thad Jones got together, well, what can I tell you? I mean, the records prove it. Gee whiz, I listen to those things even today just to listen to what Mel did. The insertions of the accents, the beautiful sound that he got, and everything is in the right place. You know, whatever he did, his ears were open, eyes and ears were open. That's even, I talk about him today when I talk about drummers that play in the band. I said, get some of Mel Lewis's records with Thad Jones. That's how you play in a big band. And of course, they put out a book, Mel's book, and the book is wonderful because when you're reading the drum chart, Mel says, now be careful here, and emphasize this. Don't try to emphasize all the brass figures you say. You're a rhythm section player. Only pinpoint the ones that are important. And he could do that. The rest of the time he's playing time. And behind the soloists, number one. because he's listening. He's listening to the soloist, you know. Also a Gretsch user.
How about Art Blakey? You mentioned him.
Oh, Art Blakey, boy. He was a volcano, all right. I think he's the only drummer I know that had a group that as long as he did, and so many great players came out of his groups. When you think of all the personnel that were in his band, Winton, everybody, all the great trumpet players, all the great saxophone players, everybody that came out of that band went on to make it, you know. And because of him, they said, yeah, Art, he taught us how to play. He was every time I heard Art play, it was so swinging, just Mother Earth swinging, you know. All I could do was just sit there and groove right along with him, you know. He could do it, and one of the guys that came after him is Elvin Jones. Now Elvin played a little beyond him. I mean, he plays a little out there, you know, but he had that same earth quality about the sound of his drums. I just heard him play not too long ago, and on the way to the venue to hear him play, I thought to myself, Elvin reminds me of Mother Earth decorated with syncopation. that's him, you know. But Art was that way. He produced a sound, and all the drummers followed that suit. That wonderful being able to play that aggressive, and yet swinging, you know. And because I know all the players I know, like Dizzy and all these guys, they love to play with him because there it was. I mean, there's no question about it. When you had him, you had 3/4 of the rhythm section right there with him, you know. And definitely one of my favorite players. And I listen to him all the time. I learned so much from him.
A couple of guys, Roy Hart or Chuck Flores.
Oh, Chuck Flores. Now, I heard more of Chuck's playing than I did of Roy Hart, but I know Roy was a very good player. And I think the only reason he stopped playing is because he wanted to get into business, you know, owning his own music store. That's where I first met him, when he had his own shop and everything. Mm-hmm. But Roy was a very good player, excellent. I go way back with him in the New York days too, you know. And Chuck Flores, I think, is still playing. Very good player, yeah. Wonderful teacher. He's one of those combination guys that there are a lot of great players, but you can't teach. But he's a great player, and he can teach also. And that's what he's doing quite a bit now, besides playing too. But excellent player. I recommend a lot of drummers that go out to the West Coast and want a teacher, I say call Chuck Flores.
How about Sam Milano?
Sam Milano. I have to smile with it because I give him a lot of credit, really. The guy is 75 years old, maybe today, and he's still playing drums, still playing in a nightclub. His foot is still good. His hands are still good. The reason I smile is because he puts out books, and a lot of guys say, well, that's ridiculous for him to say that, but it isn't, because he'll say, don't go on a gig with white socks and a tuxedo. But he's right. That was a no-no. You're not supposed to wear white socks with a tuxedo. You're supposed to put black socks on, you know. But he's trying to educate these young guys that don't even know what a tuxedo is. When you join the union, you're supposed to have a tuxedo and a dark blue suit, because that's how you get your gig. And he comes from that era, but he's teaching these kids that, and he's still up with what they're doing. He writes more, he's got more books out than anybody else, and he's into every bag, country and western, rock and roll. He's telling these kids you got to know how to do it all. And he can do it all himself. He's a magician. He really is.
Bill Richmond.
Oh, Bill Richmond. Geez, boy, he was with Jerry Lewis for a long time. Bill Richmond, boy. And he played with a few other bands, too.
These are all Gretsch endorsers, you know, and I'm just picking them their names
That's
up.
where I first met him. He was playing for Jerry Lewis.
Mm-hmm.
And later he became, he got into some kind of graphics or something like that. But he came in the last two times I played at the Catalina's Club with my big band in L.A. He was a marvelous player. Just a good solid player, you know, no tricks. when I say no tricks, I mean they weren't like bombastic solos like a Gene or Buddy or Joe Jones or Chick Webb, but did good solid players, you know.
How about Jimmy Pratt?
Who?
Jimmy Pratt?
Oh, Jimmy Pratt, boy. You're naming some guys that I haven't seen for years. I lost track of him completely. He was a good player. Excellent. A lot of times when I went over to the Gretsch factory, he'd be there. Because he invented that muffler for Gretsch, bass drum muffler that you could control. Because years ago you put a strip of muffler in there, and that's it. You couldn't control it. Some guys liked that strip hugged up against the head. Other guys liked it away from it. And he invented that Jimmy Pratt bass drum muffler. It was a great idea.
Okay.
Oh, good player.
Charlie Smith?
Charlie Smith, left-handed player. I followed him on Duke's band. He was playing in Duke's band before I joined the band. I couldn't understand, knowing Charlie, as great as he is, why Duke got rid of him. But Duke didn't get rid of him. He was starting his own group or doing something with Bird. He's on quite a few things with Charlie Parker, and that's what he wanted to do. So it wasn't that Duke enjoyed the way he played. He loved the way he played. He would have been there. Great player. Left-handed. Not only a bebop player, but also straight-ahead swing. I know a lot of guys, Charlie Shavers, Dizzy, guys that worked with him, they said he was magnificent. Yeah.
You've already talked a lot about this guy, but I'll still say his name. Elvin Jones?
Oh, Elvin. Mother Earth.
Mm-hmm.
Boy, I'll never forget, Buddy Rich and I were in London together. He was there with his big band, I was working with Oscar Peterson. And we both had the night off, and we looked in the paper and said, oh, Elvin's at the Ronnie Scott's, let's go. So Buddy had a suede jacket on. We went in to hear Elvin, and we sat, like where you're sitting, that's where his bass drum was. And Buddy Rich and I are sitting. So when he looked at us, he said, oh, it's going to be one of those nights, huh? Okay. Well, he started playing, and he's got that little bass drum, like an 18-inch bass drum. And Buddy kept leaning over me and said, how does he get that sound on that little bass drum? Because both of us have a 24-inch bass drum, the big one. There he was, Elvin. Well, he played something that night that I very seldom hear. Played a very simple waltz, 1, 2, 3, 1, just that tempo. Now, you would never think that would be a drum solo, right? A waltz like that, that's anything but a drum solo. Well, he played a drum solo on that, and he followed the melody, 64-bar chorus, and he played about 6 choruses and came out right on the money. Now, that's musical. Elvin is Elvin Jones. It's his own style. You talk about a guy that's got his own initial identification. That's him. He doesn't play like anybody else. He can play with a groove. He can go into a tirade, and you'll say, "Where did he go? He lost me." But yeah, he comes out of it.
Right.
Comes out of it, and he knows what he's doing.
Mm-hmm.
He told me he wants to do an album with me, and I'm jumping at the opportunity because I know I'll learn an awful lot by working with him because he's got another way of playing. It's Elvin Jones, and Francine had a chance to hear him play, and for a person that's never seen him before, you had to be impressed, right?
Yes.
He's just he's that kind of a player. Now he did something with Duke Ellington. He joined Duke's band, and there were 2 drummers, him and somebody else. And Duke, even though that wasn't Duke's style, he could recognize, and he told me, that guy's got a lot of talent. See, Duke could see it, what he was all about, see.
How about another drummer that was at Duke, Sam Woodyard?
Oh, Sam. I would say, I worked with Duke, as you know.
Mm-hmm.
Sam Woodyard swung that band harder than anybody, really. Forget me. I mean, okay, I created something in Duke's band, but that man swung that band, you hear what I said? Harder than anybody. And the proof is when you listen to Diminuendo and Crescendo and Blue from Newport, that's all you have to hear. It's not going to get any better than that. It'll never get any better than that. Sam Woodyard.
Mm-hmm.
Jimmy Woody, Sam Woodyard, and Duke. The 3 of them got a hold of a tempo, and I never heard that kind of groove ever. I don't know if I'll ever hear that again either.
How about a fellow by the name of Jack Adams?
Oh, Jack Adams had a drum shop in Boston. I never heard Jack play. I think Jack was a good player, but Buddy Rich, all of us, every time we went to Boston, we went down to the drum shop. If that's the same Jack Adams
That's what it is.
from Boston.
How about somebody else you've mentioned a lot now? Max Roach.
Oh boy, Max taught me how to play musical. Max Roach and I were the first two guys to get into the very first clinics, what they call clinics today, seminars, and I'm talking about in the 40s. On that particular, Henry Adler worked that out. It was Henry Adler, Humberto Morales was there to demonstrate the Latin things. Saul Goodman from the New York Philharmonic, timpani player, was there to demonstrate timpani, and Max and I were the two set players. In those days, being a tap dancer, I played everything rhythmically. And after that, Max said to me, he said, "Lou, you got a lot of talent. Learn how to play musical as well as rhythmical." I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, for instance, if you're playing Cherokee, play off of the tune." He taught me that. And sure enough, it took me in another avenue. Now I not only learned how to play rhythmically, but I started to learn how to play melodically. That was Max Roach. And I listened to him with Dizzy, and there's another guy that came up with an extension of Joe Jones, but yet it was Max Roach. See, this is what I try to tell youngsters today. You can listen to somebody and pick up things, but then create some of your own. That's what made Max so individualistic. He's playing Max Roach, you know. Steve Gadd, even though he did his homework by knowing where he came from, he still plays like Steve Gadd. He picked up this from Max, picked up this from Art Blakey, Joe Jones, but yet he sounds like Steve Gadd.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that bothers me, and that's when I become an angry man, is when I see one guy trying to copy somebody else right down to the T. And there are a couple of guys that have done that. And all I can tell them is, I tell you what, man, you're a bad carbon copy. Learn how to play yourself.
How about Philly Joe Jones?
There's another melodic player. I had a chance to go to Japan with him, Charlie Persip, Buddy Rich, and myself. And the biggest name on that tour at that time was Philly Joe, because all the Japanese were listening to Miles Davis at that time, and there was Philly. No question about his musicianship. He's in a groove with Max, Art Blakey, Philly Joe Jones, Papa Joe, all those guys. Philly was destined, if he would have lived much longer, to be in that upper echelon, because he had so much to offer, and he died so young. You know? We're even today, a lot of young players are studying what Philly did on a lot of those records that he did, the way he played so musical, you know.
How about Jimmie Cobb?
Jimmie Cobb, yeah. You know, there's another. I was going to mention his name in reference to Philly Joe, because we're still figuring out some of the things, not the technical things they did, but their sound and the way they tuned their drums, the sound, and the way they played behind solos. They had an innate sense of following the players, you know. Maybe today, when I rehearse a band, like a college band, I'll always say to the drummer, "Can you hear what the saxophone player is playing?" He says, "No." And I found out later on that when they rehearse these college bands, and they're all good, but the one thing they don't have time to set up microphones or they got the hall, and most of the places they rehearse in are not very good, so they don't get a chance to hear the soloist. They're just playing. They know it's a center solo. They don't hear him until it's time to do the concert. I said, that's bad. You've got to be able to hear the soloist when you're playing at all times. Otherwise, you can't give them the proper backing. And that's what Philly and Jimmie Cobb could do, you know.
Tony Williams.
Oh, boy. First time I met him, his father brought him, I was playing with Ellington, and his father brought him in to hear a concert. And he said, "I want you to meet my son, Tony Williams." And I looked at him. I knew right away he was going to be a drummer. he had drums all over his head, all over his feet, all over his body. Oh, what a talented young man. I can't say enough about Tony Williams, really. He's Vinnie Colaiuta and all these young drummers today are studying Tony Williams and Dave Weckl and all these, even Steve Gadd. What he did with that early Miles Davis group, you know, spelled it all out, you know. Technique, musicality, dynamics, he's got it all. And he's a wonderful little guy, too. I had a chance to, we were touring in Europe with our big band a couple of years ago, and we ran into him quite a bit, him and Herbie Hancock. He was with that group, you know. And every chance I get, if he's playing somewhere, I want to go because I get a lesson from him. He's such a beautiful player, boy, and he's still young yet, and Lord knows what he's coming up with, because these are the kind of players that always create something new, but it's new for a reason. Duke used to say, if you're going to be different, you can't be different just to be different. You got to have a reason to be different. And a guy like Tony Williams or Elvin, when they create something different, they're able to prove it. And they do it on the drum set. And when you hear it, you say, yeah, that's it.
How about Chico Hamilton?
Chico, there's another guy. Boy, you're probably wondering, Chet, I've got such a nice word to say about all you guys, but you're naming all these great players that I know, that I've heard them play. They're all great players. You know, I've been lucky to be associated with all these guys, and not one of them is a bad player. They're all Chico. I think Max is doing some of the stuff that Chico did a few years ago as far as playing with different instruments. Max is into that like Dizzy said, he's a professor. You know, he gets into deep music, strings. You know, and Chico was the first guy that I heard playing with a cello and different instruments. You know, musical instruments. And Max probably had that same idea years ago too, but he's doing a string quartet with another quartet. You know, that's beautiful. That's music. You know, and it's taking us on another avenue, but yet it's good musically. I have a lot of great appreciation for those guys because they had an idea and they went through with it. You know what I mean? They may have been criticized, like I was criticized. Everybody gets criticism after. When I came up with the first two the bass drums, you know, they said, "What's this guy up to? You know, he should go to the moon with Buck Rogers." You know. So, but they stuck with these ideas, and it's good because they created something that's different, but for a reason. Musically, it worked. What Max is doing now, and what Chico did then, and I'm sure Max had those ideas, because they're both very tasty, very sensitive players. You know, everything doesn't have to be loud. They've proven that you can take a drum set and play with strings, take a drum set and play with woodwinds. You know, take a drum set and play with string quartet. It'll work. Music.
How about Jake Hanna?
Jake Hanna's another guy like Shelly. Just a great, absolute great. I've heard Jake play in every capacity with just a duet, just him and a bass player. I've heard him play with just a piano player, and I've heard him in a trio, quartet, quintet, big band, and every time he's always there. That's stuff he did with Woody's band. Jake, I think, you know, when I talked about humor, we talked about the humor that Buddy Rich had and the humor that Shelly Manne had. I think all great drummers have a certain degree of humor. You'd have to have, you know.
You're comedians.
Yeah, really. Because and when you play drums, you make people smile, and you play a lick that's maybe an old time lick, but it works, you know. And every drummer, even way back with Ben Pollock. Now there's an old drummer. When I heard him play, I used to smile because he was a comedian too, on the drum set. But what he played was humorous, you know. And who are we talking about now?
Jake
Hanna.
Yeah.
Jake I had to smile every time I hear him play because he'd come up with a lick, boy, that was, you know, and then later on he'd say, oh yeah, he'd have something funny to say about that, you know. And great player, still a great player, still doing his job. And I'll take a minute to take a sip of this.
Please.
Aqua
No.
fresca.
Yeah. Salute.
Yeah.
No, I don't want him to. I offered to break him a little earlier, but the thoughts
him.
just flow and flow. This is so great. I can't tell you what wonderful
I moved
materials.
the car up closer, so the car is right
Oh,
outside
good.
the door.
Good. Okay. Excellent.
Yeah.
I've just got a few more here that I want to run
Yeah.
by you. Charlie Perry.
Charlie Perry. Oh boy, there.
Mm-hmm.
You know, your name is these last few guys. Well, Jake Hanna. No, I see Jake quite a bit, and he's still playing great.
Mm-hmm.
Charlie Perry was another guy that went into teaching, not too much playing, and I think he probably. I think the last time I saw him a few years ago, he was having a few physical problems, but I hope he's out of that because he's every time I've heard Charlie play, he's always great natural player, like a guy that would have the technique. He was more like a Steve Gadd. You know, he could do it all. He had the technique and he had the facility to play in the band, swing, hard swinging. You know, but I think he's devoting most of his time just to teaching.
How about Sonny Payne?
Sonny Payne, boy, he kicked that bassy band. I talked to Neil Hefti about Sonny Payne because for a while everybody was kind of criticizing Sonny because he'd throw the sticks up in the air. He was like Lionel, you know. He was a juggler, you know. But boy, when he came down to playing drums, and Neil Hefti, who did the album Atomic Bomb, which brought Basie back into the charts. Because when you think about all the Kid from Red Bank, Whirly Birds, Splanky, all of that was you know, Little Darling, and he played. Neil Hefti told me, he said, I don't care what they say, Sonny Payne played for me, and Neil Hefti knows what he's talking about. And Basie also said that there's no question that Sonny Payne was a spark plug in my band. He could do it. And now here's a guy. You talk about Gene Krupa. Gene was visual as well as a guy that played well. And Sonny Payne was that way. The minute you walked in to hear Basie's band, whoosh, right away your eyes went right up to Sonny Payne. Because there he was, man. I don't think you ever heard him. Had a chance to say it. Francine didn't get it. But that's what happened. He was a great showman, and he sparked that band.
Mm-hmm.
Died too soon.
Really?
But we don't govern that. We let the good man upstairs handle that. But it's he made a mark, a big one too.
How about Art Taylor? Still around?
Art Taylor, yes. I just read a wonderful whole about 5 pages on Art and the Modern Drummer. This was a few issues back, and I know him. He's one of the guys like Nick Fatool. You know, he had a drum set, and he treated it like a musical instrument. And all the guys that played for him said Art Taylor was like a rock. You know, whatever he played, whatever you wanted him to play, you knew it was going to be done. No frills, no nothing, just solid playing. That was Art Taylor. And a lot of guys learned a lot from Art, a lot of drummers, you know.
Charlie Persig. Another one's still around.
Charlie Persip. Boy, you're naming all goodies here. All these are all great players. Boy. Charlie Persip. Boy. You're getting me excited talking about all these guys. Because they're all my friends.
I'm getting an interview with a lot of these guys. Charlie Persip said he'd do it with Max. I just talked to Max on the phone. He's going to work with me.
Yeah.
When I got you, I said, that's it. I got it all.
Yeah. Well, you're naming all guys that I know personally. I know how they play. Charlie Persip. When I first heard him with Dizzy's band, I knew right away I was going to be listening to a great player because first of all, Dizzy wouldn't have him if he wasn't great, you know. And Charlie's another guy that can do it all. He's like Jake Hanna. and Shelly Manne and all these guys. He's got the technique, he's got the know-how, he's got the experience. And the last time I saw him, they had a night for me in New York. And they had Steve Gadd there, they had Charlie Persip there, they had Al Miller there, they had Butch Miles was there, and Les DeMero, and all these guys. My band was on stage. I had no idea this was going on. Even Francine kept it secret from him. And he played. They played all my charts, you know, or tunes pertaining to my band. Not all my charts, I shouldn't say that, but they were all the tunes that I recorded. And each one of these guys played one of the tunes, you know. And there was Charlie, playing like crazy, staying right with everybody. Yeah, magic player.
How about a couple of rock and rollers, Phil Collins and Charlie Watts?
Now, Phil Collins, I'm not too familiar with. I know he's a great player. He's a left-handed player, from what I understand.
Right.
But I have never heard him play in person.
Okay.
So I would be remiss to say, yeah, I know about Phil. I know he's a wonderful player because I know a lot of guys that I know that know about drums. They said, Lou, you know him as a singer, you know, and he's been very popular. But I do know that,
Yeah, we just saw him on TV.
Yeah.
Great.
But I know that he's a wonderful player because a lot of guys that I know that played well, and the drummer in his group for a while,
Chester Thompson,
told me. Now there's another great player. Chester's a wonderful player. He said, Lou, he can play some drums. So, but I never heard him. All I can go by is records, and Chester's on the records.
Right.
But I know I know for a fact from a lot of people like Chester and other people, they say Phil can play drums.
How about Charlie Watts with the Rolling Stones? You ever had any experience with him?
Who's this?
Charlie Watts with.
Oh,
Rolling
Charlie
Stones?
Watts. Yeah, I know Charlie. Yeah, he can play. Now he's a swing drummer.
Right.
And yet he's playing with the Rolling Stones.
Yeah.
And you know, you can't blame him because he can fit. He plays that groove. He's making a lot of money, but yet his heart is in. His setup is as the swing drummer's setup too. He doesn't have a rock and roll setup at all.
Right.
Oh, Charlie's one of my favorite players. He's great.
Oh, that's good to
Oh
hear.
man, he's wonderful.
Okay, those are all the endorsers I wanted you to talk
Yeah.
about. Now talk a little bit, just a few more minutes here about Phil Collins. Phil Grant.
Phil Grant.
People inside the company, the Gretsch company.
Well, Phil. First of all, Phil was the right man for Fred Gretsch to hire because Phil was an excellent player himself. You know, he was in that Franco Golan band,
Right.
and he was a very fine drummer, and he was sympathetic to all the artists that were using Gretsch drums. He listened to what all of us had to say. He would go to the venue, like if Mel Lewis was playing somewhere or Don Lamond, he'd be there, and the first thing he'd say is, "What can I do? What can we do to make the drum set better?" That was Phil Grant. Every time I played in New York, I made I got on the subway, went all the way to Brooklyn, and the first couple of times he met me in New York because I didn't know what subway to take. You know, you can get lost and me with my directions. I'd wind up in Cincinnati, right, honey?
Yes, right.
So Phil took me the first few times, then he told me to take the D train, whatever it was, to get to Brooklyn, and they always had time for me. I'd go over there and spend a couple hours in the morning. They'd take me out to lunch, and I'd come back and do another hour or two, just talking about the instrument. What can we do to make a better Gretsch drum? What can we do to do this? You know, the hardware. He became a real family friend, and long after I left the company, we still wrote to one another. And I know he's somewhere. I lost track of him the last couple of years.
But in New England, he also agreed to do an interview with me. I'm really excited about that. And when I mentioned your name, he went, "Oh, Louie."
Yeah, that was my man. He was a beautiful guy. He always had a kind word to say about everybody. He was just a beautiful human being and a good musician, you know. Fred Gretsch knew he had a special person with Phil.
What was your experience with Fred Gretsch? Did you have much experience with him?
Well, I met him, you know, through Phil, and every time I came,
Gretsch Jr.
Yeah, Fred Jr. I didn't know the old man, the first one, and Emerson Strong. Emerson at that time was already in his 80s, so I think by now, unless he's still living, he must be the oldest living human being in the world. He'd be about 150. All three of us, and Fred would be right there with us. He said, "No, why don't come out and have lunch. We'd talk about.
Where was that? Where do you recall where you?
We
guys
used to
were
go to
sitting?
some old German restaurant.
Right.
You know, I remember that. Like one of those old Jacob Wirtz places, you know.
Right near the factory.
Yeah, right near the factory.
Yeah.
Did he tell you about
No,
that?
but you know, there's a Fred Gretsch now that owns Gretsch Drums.
Yeah.
He is, let's see, the grandson of Fred Sr. He's the uncle of Fred Jr. He said, and he mentioned this restaurant. He said,
Yeah.
because I'm going to New York
Yeah.
in February. He says, when you go, you got to go to this restaurant because that's where we'd always go.
It's a name like Lou Chow's
Mhm.
or Jacob Wirtz,
Mhm.
which is in Boston.
Mhm.
It's an old German restaurant, and they got the greatest food, the greatest bread, and everything in there. That was it. That's where we went. Yeah.
How about
Yeah.
Duke Kramer? Did you ever have any?
Duke, yeah, Duke. Is he still with the Gretsch
No.
company?
He's independent.
Yeah, I've seen him the last few years. There was another guy, very nice person. I think he took over from Phil. Yeah, Duke was nice, very much like Phil. You know, very very cooperative. Come to see you. You know, what can we do for you? And later on, where did I see him? He's with another company or something.
He's got his own company.
His own company?
Independent
Yeah.
merchandiser, right?
I've seen him the last 2 or 3 years. You know.
Yeah, he's also going to work. I'm so pleased all these little
Yeah.
guys are going to work with me
Yeah,
on this
wonderful
project.
guy.
Yeah.
Great.
How about, did you ever get involved in the Gretsch Drum Nights at Birdland?
In what?
Gretsch Drum Nights at Birdland?
No, I wasn't a part of that.
Okay.
That was Art Blakey, I think.
Mhm.
Was
Max,
Max.
Charlie Persip,
Yeah, Charlie.
Philly
Yeah.
Joe.
Philly Joe. Yeah, no, I wasn't in on that.
Okay.
No, I was on the road probably doing one-nighters.
Right. Too busy, right?
Yeah.
Right. Well, Mr. Bellson, I really appreciate that you've given me so much
Yeah, that's
material.
great. Listen,
God, this
hey.
is wonderful.
That's
You know, it's Gretsch was quite a unique company, and
it was.
all the endorsers. You know,
yeah.
every time I rattle off these names.
Oh yeah, and still is. You know,
Mhm.
I mean that's a great drum. It's a great drum.
Mhm.
Tony Williams, I hear the sound of his drums. They're beautiful.
Mhm.
Boy, they're still very very good. And is Max still using?
No, Max.
Max is what,
I don't
Ludwig?
think- yeah, I think he
he's-
uses Ludwig. I don't think he's an endorser
Yeah,
per se.
yeah.
He just uses Ludwig. Yeah.
But Tony Williams,
Charlie Watson and Phil Collins are still using.
still
Gretsch drums.
doing Gretsch, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a great drum. There's no
Yeah.
question about it.
It's not the company that was, boy, in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah. Oh boy, they were
That's-
swinging. And the only reason I changed back to Slingerland was because Bud Slingerland said, "Hey, you know, you made a promise to us that you'd eventually come back to us." I said, "I did. Well, I'm a man of my word." Of course, the dad still had the music store then, and
What year was this? Do you
God, that
recall?
had to be when I joined Gretch in 42,
Mhm.
62.
Was that after they sold the company? After Gretsch sold the company to Baldwin? Because that was.
That had to be in the 60s because I was with Gretch for almost 20 years.
Okay. Okay.
That had to be in the early 60s.
Mhm. Okay.
Yeah. 42, sure.
So that was your reason? You just
Well,
Bud said
yeah,
you owe me this?
yeah. Bud said, "Well, you said you were coming back with us," and so I said, "Well, if I did that, I got to keep my word." So, I went to Fred and I said, "Well, Fred, he said, oh, we hate to lose you, but if anything happens that you want to come back with us, the door's open,
Yeah, because he had you for a lot of good years.
Oh yeah,
A lot of great years.
yeah, definitely.
One thing last thing I want to talk to you about is this.
Oh yeah. The first time I set up this set of drums was with Ted Fiorito in 1946. See, because in 42 I was with Ted and then with Benny Goodman. Then Uncle Sam got me for 3 years. Then I went right back to Ted in San Diego. Was the first time a place called the Imig Manor Hotel.
Say that again. It's
Imig, I-M-I-G. Imig Manor was one of the big hotels in San Diego, right on the El Cajon Boulevard. And Ted Fiorito was a favorite there. Played all dance music, and I set up that big set of drums. And everybody kept looking at that set of drums and said, "What is that?"
They still say
And that's the first time I exposed it to the public. Then right after that, I joined Benny's band, but Benny at that time, he wasn't into this,
So they were Slingerland when you first, is that true? They were Slingerland?
No,
the
they were
first kit
Gretsch.
you had?
You mean?
The very first double, the one you talked
Oh,
about?
the
that you
very
had in
first
San
set
Diego?
was Slingerland.
But it was
that
a
was
double,
Slingerland.
so your first double bass drum?
No, that
kit?
was just single bass drum.
Oh, okay.
No, I'm misleading you. Not in 1942. This was 46.
Okay.
The second time I joined
Oh, okay.
Ted.
Okay.
Because the first time I joined Ted, it was just Slingerland set.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
The second time, when I got out of the Army, then I had this set.
Right.
46. And then when I joined Tommy Dorsey in 47, he loved this setup. That was it. And plus, we had a revolving bandstand. That was my idea too. And he used to push the button. So when I played the drum solo, the people, when they saw the drum set from the front, I mean, you and I would recognize it's two bass drums, but the ordinary man would say, "What is it? What are all those drums he's got?" Then the minute they turn me around, they'd say, "Oh, he's got 2 feet going." See? And Tommy would flip me around and stop me, and then flip me back around. See?
Mhm.
It was a great gimmick.
Mhm.
It was a wonderful gimmick. That was 47, but 46 is when I actually put this to use, because a lot of the other companies weren't too happy about constructing this set, but Gretsch was with me all the way on it. They said, "Yeah, okay, we'll make what you want, 20 by 20s, 26 by 18,
Almost a cocktail drum, right?
9 by 13s, 7 by 11s, 16 by 16 floor tom-tom, and an 18 by 16.
A lot of power.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Oh, that's great. This has been wonderful, Francine. Thank you for, being a part of this. You guys must get a lot of requests for interviews, and I really appreciate you taking.
Well, that's great, though. It's important. I'll tell you what's wonderful about this. I learned this from Joe Jones and Big Sid Catlett and all these guys, Max Roach. When you talk about something that's valid as this, that these guys did, the reason I do clinics is because they showed me the way, and you got to pass it off on the young people. They have to know about that, because whoever made up the thing, but you have to know where you came from. You got to know about Baby Dodds and Chick Webb and all these guys, because they're the ones that started it.
Mm-hmm.
You can't learn how to play drums today and say you don't know about Max Roach and Big Sid Cap, Joe Jones. Hey, you better get out of here and go find out what they did, because you're going to find out if you think you're doing something new, they did it a long time ago. So history has to be dealt with, and you have to know about these people because they did so much. Yeah, it's important.
That's great.